Okay, hello. This is my fourth video in a series on how the U.S. starts wars. And my title here is So You Think the U.S. Doesn't Start Wars? Well, I showed you two already, but I'm going to show you a whole bunch more. All right, how the U.S. starts these wars. All right, and another thing is, so you think democracies are inherently peace loving? Well, I'll show you how that's not true. In fact, today we'll talk about U.S. democracy and the U.S. power elite. All right. Yeah. What's the real nature of democracy here? All right. So, as an introduction, I'm gonna say this is the fourth video in a series of how U.S. starts war. I'll show you many more wars coming up here, but after just showing you two, I showed you the Iraq Invasion War and I showed you Vietnam, how those wars we started. I want to take a step back now for a moment and show you one, how this can happen in our country, a democracy. Two, the people behind this and how tight they are as a group. Three, give you an idea of how this is not a one-time incident, but a historical pattern. Four, give you a glimpse into a sociologist's perspective on how power really works in our country. All right. Um, okay, so let's take a look at the concept of democracy. All right, so democracy is a Greek word. You break it in parts. Demo means people, like demographics. Cracy means rule, so democracy means rule by the people. All right. So how do we know we have a democracy? Well, for most people, it is coming an election year, come November first Tuesday, you go to the polls and you get to cast your vote. Right. Now we know we live in a democracy because we get to participate in the selection of our representatives. Plus, we all learned this in school. You know, I think it was like seventh or eighth grade. I learned this formally in school. But you really you know that growing up as a kid, right? You learn earlier, picking up things, right? But unfortunately, typically that's all people know. Right? You ask them, they may come up with some kind of unrelated gibberish, right? But as far as how we really know, that's about it. Now, the fact that the U.S. is a democracy typically makes people feel good about their country. Right? We don't live in a dictatorship. We don't live in some totalitarian communist regime, right, where you're told to do everything. Uh, and Americans tend to be very patriotic by and large. Right? Their brains filled with images, things like the American flag, Fourth of July celebrations, fireworks, singing the national anthem during the Fourth of July or before sporting events, summer cookouts, freedom, watching baseball, football, NASCAR, national pastimes, apple pie, rock and roll, Hollywood movies in which we're the good guys in white hats riding to the rescue. Right? Now these images are simple, all right, but cherished, and oftentimes the more simple, the more powerful they are, right? The more easy and simple and down to earth they are, right? And they evoke powerful emotions, which makes patriotism a highly charged sentiment. In some cases, almost explosive, because I believe it's because that emotion is deeply personal at the core of our ego identities, of who we are, who we want to, how we want to see ourselves. And if you say a word against patriotism, a lot of people will go crazy and attack. Right? Emotions are powerful, especially when rooted in self, ego. But at the same time, we all have a rational aspect of ourselves. And in the back of our minds, pretty much everyone knows that U.S. democracies are far from perfect. In whatever way you understand that, to whatever extent, right? We know that, well, democracy isn't perfect. However, can U.S. democracy be downright problematic? And I want you to recall during my first war on the Iraq invasion war, I showed you a video of General Wesley Clark giving a speech, right? And he starts off his speech by saying, our government was, seized by a policy coup, right? A small group of men took over the policy of this country and steered it where they wanted, in a totally non-democratic way. Right? And he said this, he was shocked, right? Like he was shocked that he discovered that we have a plan to overthrow the governments of 7 Middle East nations in 5 years, right? when in fact we do that all the time. Okay. So, question. Is the Iraq policy coup a novel one-time occurrence, or has that happened throughout our history? And is it possible for a small group of people to acquire too much power in our government? Right? Now, I know the conspiracy theory birds, right? The guys who are going to chirp this, oh, conspiracy theory, he's crazy, you can't do that, right? Well, these guys are going to know zero facts, right? And what's funny about them is if you ask them, I've done this a lot, when I've been accused of being a conspiracy theorist, after teaching a person a bunch of facts, maybe 100 or 200 facts, I first ask them, well, how many facts do you remember? And they're lucky to get 3. And those 3 are vague, distorted, full of errors, right? So they barely remember anything, right? And then you ask them, well, what is a conspiracy theory? Define it for me. And damn if they'll not have like extreme difficulty, spitting out one sentence. It's vague, it's hazy, it's all, well, conspiracy theory is, when the government, you think, and it's crazy, and, right? And so that forms the basis of their entire perception, their entire reality is based on something they cannot formulate in their brain. If you cannot verbalize something, right, that means you cannot conceive it, accurately and fully. Because all thought, complex thought, is in language. All right, so, I joke. It's not conspiracy theory. It's just a joke. All right. So, is there a power elite in the United States that can and has hijacked our democracy, whether through acquiring key bureaucratic positions or even being elected to office, right? And can they start the wars that we fight, causing all the death and destruction from those wars, right? No, you think they can't? All right. So we're going to talk about U.S. wars and the power elite. And the term power elite was coined by a guy named C. Wright Mills, this fellow here, sociologist. I think he was like a sociologist somewhere down in Texas or something like that. I don't know, somewhere in the South. Anyways, now this is what I teach sociology classes. This chunk there. All right, but I'm not going to teach you all this. All right, I just want to introduce you to one of the concepts that C. Wright Mills uses. Right, it's a term called the military-industrial complex. Many of you may have heard of it before. Right, a lot of people think, well, that's just a radical term, right? There's a bunch of liberals saying this, right? No, this is a term that was coined by Republican President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Supreme commander of all Allied forces in World War II in Europe. Right? He coined this term in his farewell address, warning the country of the military-industrial complex. Right? And honestly, this is just my take on Eisenhower. Right? Yeah, I liked Eisenhower. I remember I told you how FDR was my favorite president, hands down. Right? Yeah, I kind of like Eisenhower too, but I also saw that Eisenhower. To a large extent, was naive, right? He didn't really know what was going on. I think he was played and taken for a ride, right? And by the end of his presidency, he finally started figuring things out, right? And so he warned the country of the military-industrial complex. We'll take a look at what that's all about in a moment here. So I'm going to skip down, and so I say here, I pose the question again. Can they even start the wars that we fight and all the death and destruction caused by those wars? Right? No? Well, today we're going to examine how power can be concentrated in the U.S. and we're going to look at the wars of the power elite. Okay? So to begin, we'll do a quick review to kind of reactivate in your mind the 2 wars we covered already. All right, the first war was the Iraq invasion war, and I showed you how this is a matter of using timing to manipulate the American Congress and public into the Iraq invasion war, right? How it was really centered upon the 9/11 attacks, 9/11, 2001, by Al Qaeda, led by Bin Laden, all right? and how they use timing to do a bait and switch and flip this, all that fear and terror. You know, this is pretty terrifying stuff, right? Uh, Major buildings in the United States being attacked, right? Thousands of people dying. Whatever, 3,000 people died, I think, in here alone or so, right? Over 3,000. And people desperate, you know, to escape the burning fires, jumping out of buildings 80, 90 stories high, whatever, right? You know, they rather fall to their death instead of being burnt alive, right? Yeah, that's terrifying. That's horrible, right? And how all of this, caused by Al Qaeda, was then flipped onto Iraq and used to justify a war against Iraq, right? And I showed you how they timed all this. They manufactured a big wave of fear, a big blitz of fear campaign here, right? Right. And then in the midst of this fear, right, they started saying, well, we need this resolution, right? This is going to keep us safe. And then they timed the vote for the resolution right before the congressional recess, which is just 3 weeks before the November election. And this is the leverage. This is the backstop here, right? What you use to twist arms to get people to vote for this resolution. Because in the toxic fear environment they created, to vote against this, right, you just committed political suicide. You're dead meat in the water come November election, right? And then, they bragged about this, how on September 7th, they bragged to the press, someone bragged to the press how they got a meticulously planned strategy to get, everyone to go against Iraq and Saddam, right? And to make it difficult for anyone to vote against the resolution in the end, right? Now, as soon as they got that resolution, they got their hot little ticket to war, right? Did Americans suspect that? No, right? History repeats itself. This has been done 3 times in U.S. history, at least 3 times that I know of, right? To start wars and to justify whole wars, all you need is a congressional resolution. You don't need a declaration of war, right? And another time this exact same thing was done, very similar, was how we manufactured the Vietnam War through a manufactured incident called the Gulf of Tonkin incident, right? And the key guy to get this going was this guy here, McGeorge Bundy, right? He wrote the 30-day plan, which is a plan where you send signals, and they did just about everything on that plan, right? And more, right? Now going back to May, he was saying, hey, can we send these threat signals to North Vietnam? Just like the ones that, got the Soviets to react and put in missiles in Cuba, and that caused a Cuban Missile Crisis, right? The Soviets looked like the bad guys threatening us, right? Can we do the same thing with North Vietnam? Send them threat signals, right? And then sure enough, he comes with a plan just 3 days later, right? Plus the first draft of the congressional resolution, which they passed here, which became the hot little ticket to war, justifying the whole war, right? The legal basis for war. So they sent they sent a bunch of threat signals in a first wave here in mid-June, another in mid-July after we started invading into North Vietnam, right? Dropping commandos, right? And then you had the whole thing where you had these attacks, covert, secret black ops attacks, right? 2 boat attacks, one on the base, which has a torpedo boat flotilla, right? And then you have air. Then you send up a U.S. ship right to where you attacked, and as you're going up, you have 2 air attacks. So there's 4 attacks while this U.S. ship is going up, and that creates an incident where the U.S. ship is actually attacked, right? And then you got your dramatic event, right? And then they sent 2 ships the very next day, only 5 hours later, right? And a second attack never occurred, but they used that as justification for both the bombing raid and the resolution, which became the basis for the war. All right, so that's a quick review of 2 ways the U.S. has started wars. Hopefully you remember more than that. All right. So now bear in mind in this lesson that this is not an exhaustive analysis of the power leap. It is but an introductory exposure. Think of it as like an appetizer, or think of it as like a slice that you put under on a microscope slide, right? I'm not saying this is like a end all beat all, explain everything. It's just a tiny look at it, right? So in this examination, we're going to focus on one group called the Bonesmen. It's a very elite group out of Yale, very small, and it's a power club, I call it. All right, and we'll examine their relationship with the military-industrial complex. And I put here hydrological engineering because that's a term that I've taught in my sociology classes, and it is, I guess I could say, for clever people who really see how to control wealth, right? It's about controlling collective resources, controlling collective revenues, and steering that towards yourself so you can tap off it and become super wealthy, right? One of the ways is through the military-industrial complex. It's not the only way, right? I may talk about this at some time. Now, the military-industrial complex, in my opinion, I say here, did not form until World War I. That's where we pick up the story here, all right? If to get a historical perspective, we talked about going down here. We talked about the evolution of wars, and there's many different ways of studying the evolution of wars. One is war fighting methods, and this is not. This is more the economic resource view of the evolution of wars, right? The underlying driving forces behind wars, right? And what was I going to say here? Oh, yeah. So going back to antiquity, to classic times, right? Weapons production was always profitable to some extent, right? But I'm saying it got super profitable when we went into mass production, drastically increasing the volume of production with mechanization, with machine production, which is what industrial, the revolution was all about. All right. So quickly here, just as a quick, review here, the Industrial Revolution, you could say, began roughly around 1800, right? I mean, it began before, really, right? But roughly, we'll just say around 1800, and it started with the textile industry, right? The first things to really be manufactured by machine were textiles, right? Then about 1830s, it started to expand into different areas. One is you start developing ag machines, right? The McCormick Reaper and all sorts of different machines came pretty quick. The needle, what was it? The needle seeder or whatever. A whole bunch of other things, right? Threshing machine, right? And then about the same time, also in the 1830s, I mean, steam engines had been around for a while. Iron's been around for a while, but the application of this in trains started to really pick them up right around 1830, right? And they were used in shipping as well, steam engines, right? Before 1830s, actually, they're using it, but about 1830s it started getting big. And I know the first major transatlantic steamer was a Cunard Company job that was made about 1840, right? But a key thing was the Industrial Revolution started being applied to firearms, right? Now, how this happened was in the United States, right? You got creative American people, right? And they developed what's called the American system, which was applied later on to different, different products and commodities. But this system developed, right? The driving force behind this system was a need for interchangeability. And the idea is this, right? Going back when you first had firearms, all those firearms were handmade, custom made, right? Which meant that, it took a lot of time. The parts were, precisely made for that weapon. Now, if you had a part of a weapon, some musket or flintlock, whatever, right, that busted, right, well, you had to custom make the repair part or just make a whole new damn weapon, right? And it was costly, expensive, and time consuming. So what they wanted was have, uniformity of parts, uniformity of all weapons, and then you can mass produce these, individual parts and just replace parts cheaply, right? That's the idea behind interchangeability. And so what it did was it drove the machine production of tools and, in this case, weapons, right? So now you're using machines to make tools, right? Like firearms. And later on, this led to to mass production, all right, through machines. All right. So now the first big use of this system was the Civil War, 61, 65, whatever. And one of the things the Civil War was known for was uh, the first real war profiteers, right? I mean, you can just Google war profiteers, right? It'll take you right to the Civil War, I'm sure, right? And then you'll find the word shoddy. That became very popular because they went together. The war profiteers were making shoddy crap, getting these big fat government contracts and just giving soldiers crap, right? Anyways, and then again, the American system was used to produce weapons for the Spanish-American War, right? But the real massive scale production didn't occur until World War One, and in this war, massive mountains of wealth were made. I studied the World War One in great detail, the economics behind it, and it is just massive growth in production of all areas, right? Not just weapons, not just munitions, but you name it, anything from pork bellies to cotton to leather. Uh, Wars are a great stimulus for production. Uh, all right, so now I want to just mention here. This is just as an aside to give you a larger scope of things. There are some side effects of World War One, right? One is the world's financial center. The center of the universe of finance, banking, money, was shifted with changing tides from, let's say, Antwerp to Amsterdam, then to London, right? Going through all the different wars. I'm not going to go through that, right? Who gained power, right? But with World War One, it shifted to Wall Street, from London to Wall Street. Uh, and also, the U.S. became a big exporter of capital. I mean, we were exporting capital, for example, into Latin America, going way back, 1840s and so forth, right? Um, into the Caribbean. But it was after World War One where we were flush with cash, and that really increased significantly, right? Especially into Latin America and the Caribbean. Um, Now, another significant outcome was that, to purchase, we we provided at least half of all the munitions used by Britain and France in the war, right? We're the arsenal of democracy, where it's called, right? The greatest industrial power in the earth. So we crunched out a lot of weapons, right? But the thing about it is, they had to pay for it. How did they pay for it? They paid for it with debt, right? They're selling us bonds, flooding us with bonds, and we're buying them up, right, to pay for the stuff, the finances. But the thing about it is, after the war, they're stuck with all this debt, and they dumped it on Germany. They're saying, we're not paying for this. Look at Germany to pay for it. And they did so in the form of war reparations, right? However, unfortunately, this became a big source of resentment of the German people, right? And that was part of what, attracted them to a strong man like Hitler. A guy who says, we're not going to take this crap anymore. Screw them. We're not paying for this. We're going to build up our armed forces, whatever. So that led to that in part. I mean, it's not as simple as that, but that in part led to the rise of Hitler. And of course, Hitler brought us World War II. Um, so there's consequences. All right. Anyways, this is just a brief introductory view of the power elite. Focusing on the bonesmen. Right. So key concepts to keep in mind here is bonesmen and the military-industrial complex. All right. Uh, so bonesmen, power elite. I mean, this power elite, these guys, all these bonesmen are highlighted in gray, right? And these guys were childhood friends. The families knew each other. They grew up, roughly in the same neighborhoods. They intermarried. They had the same banks, same corporations, same investments. They go to the same, schools, prep schools, and then they go to the same, universities like Yale. And then they're in the same clubs, for example, right? And then they get together in industry, finance, or politics, right? All right. So, as a starting point, like I said, I believe the start of the military-industrial complex was really World War One, where mountains of wealth were made off of weapons production, but more than just weapons production, right? And it's where a group of guys cut their teeth. These bonesmen, tight group of bonesmen. Well, let me get to this first. So, one direct tie to the military-industrial complex is through critical positions in the War Industries Board, World War One. Right, one guy, the director of Small Arms War Industries Board, was Samuel P. Bush. the father of Prescott Bush, the grandfather of George H.W. Bush, and so forth, right? Another guy was Robert Lovett. You'll see his name come back quite a bit here. He was considered the architect of the Cold War. And one of these guys. Now, who are these guys here? These guys are all partners in a bank called Brown Brothers Harriman, which prior was W.A. Harriman and Company Bank, right? All right. So guys like Prescott Bush, Averill Harriman, Roland Harriman, Robert Lovett, Percy Rockefeller. You heard the Rockefeller family from Nelson Rockefeller, oil, whatever, right? This dude, I can't pronounce his name, so I'm not going to try, right? Anyways, all these guys, right? One of which is Delano. You know how FDR was related to, Franklin Delano Roosevelt? How these power guys would, as their middle names, whatever, or even as their first names, would use a family name, right, to show their power family relationship, right? An interesting thing about, talking about power lead, FDR, my favorite president of all time, right? Well, he is related to 12 other presidents, either directly through blood or through marriage. Right? Shows how concentrated power can be in the United States. That's aside. So another guy is Thatcher Brown, who was a descendant of the original founders of the Brown Brothers Bank, which was merged with Harriman, I believe in like 1931, 32. All right. So now so these guys are all partners in a bank, all bonesmen. You'll see more and more how this bank is central to a lot of stuff that goes on. And it is the largest private investment bank in the United States. Maybe even in the world, but I don't know. Right? It's big, private though. It's not like you can deposit your money there. All right. So, and a key thing of being private is, I believe. Anyway, this is my belief. Why is it important to be private? Well, in a public bank, right, you have to issue reports. Stuff on your investments, whatever. Right? Here, you issue nothing. You have to report on nothing, right? All right, so this bank, kind of a notorious bank here. Its background, this along with another bank that was run by Prescott Bush, that was also run by his father-in-law, George Herbert Walker, called the Union Banking Union Banking Corporation, right? Both of them financed Hitler, the Nazi Party, and helped build the Nazi war industries, right? And that's in the 1930s. But even after we went to war with Germany in December of 1941, shortly after Pearl Harbor, we went to war with Germany, right? Even after that, 4 Bush Harriman corporations, including banks, steel firms, steel plants, and mining companies, continued their German operations until FDR shut them down in November of 1942. That's almost a full year after we're fighting, Germany. So think about it. American boys are fighting the Germans, all right? You may say, well, we weren't really fighting them directly in Europe. Okay, but in 42, we're fighting them in North Africa, right? In 42, we're fighting them on the North Atlantic. In 42, there's American volunteers fighting, Germans in the British Royal Air Force, right? So American boys are fighting the Germans, and these guys are continuing their industrial operations for the Germans, right? And things that would provide them with was steel, coal, 2 key industrial resources, right? And finance, key, because that pays for it all. Gold, currency, right? All right, so, these guys, bonesmen, right? Supporting our enemy, right? Right, and this all, of course, the rise of Hitler, Nazi Party, then, led to World War II. Hitler started World War II. You could say World War II was a natural outgrowth of how screwed up we left World War I, which is true, right? It's more than that. You got to throw in the Great Depression, how we responded to the Great Depression, especially with, trade wars and high tariffs and, aggressive devaluation of currency, stuff going on like that, right? Anyway, so let's see. So that's what A, F, G, H. Where's H? H. Okay. So now you may have heard of these guys, Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles. Allen Dulles was director of the CIA. John Foster Dulles was Secretary of State under Eisenhower. Both of them during the Eisenhower administration, pretty much. Allen Dulles, initially with under the Kennedy administration, at least for a year or so, right? And so these guys were lawyers for these banks, Harriman Bank, Brown Brothers Harriman, and Union Banking Corporation. All right. And the key thing about the Dulles brothers is, John Foster Dulles was a sole managing partner for a law firm called Sullivan Cromwell, which really was a neo-colonial empire builder, right? Building overseas empires, controlling the resources of other nations, right? So now, so I want to talk briefly about Robert Lansing. These guys, to show you the power club here, these guys were nephews of Robert Lansing. Robert Lansing was a key guy that was instrumental in getting the United States involved in World War I. I'll talk more about that over here. It's kind of hard to read, but hopefully we'll get to it. All right. So Robert Lansing played a key role in getting the U.S. into World War I. Okay. H-I-J, where's J? Okay. So I mentioned here Brown Brothers Harriman. Brown Brothers was a key neo-colonial bank. Sullivan Cromwell was a neo-colonial empire builder, negotiating deals with dictators, controlling resources through concessions, right? And that all fed into the Cold War, especially in the decolonization movements, right? Which got entangled with ideology, all that communism junk, right? Unfortunately, right, which complicated the situation. H-I-J-K. All right, now talking about the Cold War, which began in 1947. That's when we had the National Security Act. That's when we, basically after World War II, there was a big drawdown of the economy. All the military, contracts are being slashed, right? And we're trying to shift our economy into mass production of consumer goods, right? And building up of new, urban infrastructure, especially suburbs and so forth, right? But we started going, sliding back into recession, depression. And then the Cold War hit. Yeah, that helped, right? In 1947, National Security Act. And the key architect of the Cold War is Robert Lovett, right? You can look him up. And the thing about Robert Lovett, he was a mentor of McGeorge Bundy. Remember McGeorge Bundy, the guy I showed you up here? This guy, right? So he is being mentored by Robert Lovett, another bonesman, right? And of course, McGeorge Bundy was critical in getting us the Vietnam War. He wrote the plan for all the threat signals, right, which culminated in the actual attacks. And then we send a ship up there right into where all those attacks occurred, right? And it gets whacked, and then we get the dramatic event. All right, William Bundy was another bonesman. His brother, he was Assistant Secretary of State. He was also, involved. He was a guy that was all, blabbing in the press. We're going to attack North Vietnam, right? We're going to attack countries to the north, right? Passing threat signals, right? But the key guy, I believe, this is my belief, right? The linchpin of all this, the hub of the wheel, so to speak, was this guy, Averell Harriman, right? He was the head of Brown Brothers Harriman Bank, right? During World War II, he was ambassador to the USSR. He was a bigwig. He was hobnobbing with Roosevelt, FDR, Churchill, Stalin. He's with those crew, right? Going to all those meetings, whatever, Tehran, Yalta, all those meetings, right? And then he's ambassador to the USSR in 43 to 46, right? He volunteered to Kennedy. He says, hey, let me help you out with, Southeast Asia. So he's Assistant Secretary of State for the Far East between 1961 to 63, right? That was real convenient. And he's Acting Secretary of State leading up to the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Right. Now, this is a quote from a colonel who was deeply involved in the operations in South Vietnam during that time, a guy named Colonel William Corson, U.S. Marine Corps. He said by 1963, Harriman was running Vietnam without consulting the president or the attorney general. Attorney General is Robert F. Kennedy, right? And you know what? I read through all the documents in foreign relations of the United States for Southeast Asia, 1963 and 1964. Right, when I was doing my research on Vietnam, every damn document I read, and I tell you what, Averell Harriman kept coming up whenever these guys, Assistant National Security Advisor, Assistant Secretary of State, they're sending communication back to each other, so forth. Right, they have plans and operations. They said we got to get this approved by Averell. Right, he was at the core of decision making in Vietnam. Right, he was also a key player in the green lighting the Diem coup. Right, okay. So P element O P Q. So a corporation that made bundles of money off of the Vietnam War was a company called Root Brown. Halliburton Root Brown, because Halliburton acquired Root Brown in 1962, just 2 years before the Vietnam War really got kicked off, right? I mean, you could say 65 is when we got, a lot of troops on the ground, right? The war really started for us directly in 62 with advisors, but it didn't really pick up steam until about 65, spring of 65. But Root Brown made bundles of money. Root Brown is Halliburton, right? Okay, Q. You heard it. I mean, I'm sure people heard of Halliburton. R. Now, Root Brown, right? Going back even before they were taken over by Halliburton, they were a corporation that were big financiers, big contributors to LBJ's political campaign, right? Right. So LBJ and Root Brown were connected by the hip, right? And of course, it's his administration that got us the Vietnam War. QRS, where are we at? S. Where's that? Oh, S. Okay, we're shifting now to Bush. Bush number one. That's George H.W. Bush, right? So he worked for Dresser Industries. All right, that's one thing. Yeah. All right. Well, anyways, okay. So ST. Oh yeah, and George H.W. Bush was the president during the first Gulf War. And when I get to my lesson on exchange theory, the history of the oil industry, and the history of U.S. Policy in the Middle East, right? We'll see how, it wasn't so simple as Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait and that kicking off the war, right? But I'm going to leave that for now because I have to build up too much background information. So Bush gave us, the first Gulf War. We got the first Gulf War. And the thing about the first Gulf War was it was the first war in which a program called LOGCAP was big, right? Now, LOGCAP is called Logistical Civilian Augmentation Program. So logistics, right? And when we talk about logistics, that means supply, right? So how do you supply an army? Everything from food to medicines to munitions to weapons, everything you need for an army, right? Right? Even transporting people. Now, in the past, this was done by the military itself. The Military Supply Corps, the Military Corps of Engineers, whatever, right? Army Corps of Engineers, right? Now, this is being done by private contractors, right? So this becomes a huge private corporation money-making operation, and a key aspect of this is, given the fact that it's a war, they use that as, I guess, an excuse for no bid contracts. Oh, we don't have time to fool around in the bidding process. We'll just throw you this contract. And who was the guy in charge back then of the Department of Defense who's throwing out these contracts? Dick Cheney, right? He's Secretary of Defense, and he's tossing out huge, big, fat, no bid contracts to Halliburton, right? Okay, that's let's see, where am I at? STU. Oh, I forgot you here. Well, Bush was also director of the CIA. He was an oil expert, right? And he knew that this war would kill OPEC. Now, why I say that is, right? Um, when the first Gulf War happened, I was a big proponent of it because I didn't know jack. I was young. I didn't know any background information, and I saw Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait. I said, this can't stand, right? As far as the oil industry, as far as regional stability, as far as giving him too much uh, resources and wealth, right, right, uh, in oil, you can't have this. So I wrote the strategy for the first Gulf War, right? I was a big supporter of it. But, within a couple of years, just 2, 3 years, I started thinking, well, wait a minute. And then I put two and two together, and I realized that this war was about controlling oil prices, right? And what's other interesting is, a few years back, about 2015, I decided to go back and read newspaper articles, what people were saying about, OPEC and the oil industry, at the time of the first Gulf War. And you know what? Across the board, I got umpteen articles by oil industry experts and by economists, and they're all saying one thing. They're saying, this war is going to kill OPEC. It's going to give U.S. Greater control over oil price, right? And it's gonna make it hard for Saudi Arabia to reduce oil production, right? Um, Anyways, so it was understood way back then exactly how it's going to affect oil price. This is about indirectly controlling oil price through war, right? I know I'm jumping ahead. I got to explain and teach you far more for you to understand this, right? But I'm saying they knew exactly how this is going to affect OPEC and oil price, right? And it's going to make a lot of money through these corporations. Now, who um, who does Halliburton go back to? Well, it's owned by Dresser Industries. Since 1998, owned by Dresser Industries, right? And this is a Bonesman corporation. Who's the director of Dresser Industries for 20 years? Prescott Bush, this guy here, right? Who was a partner in Brown Brothers Harriman. Who owns Dresser Industries? Brown Brothers Harriman Bank. Originally owned by W.A. Harriman, but then it rolled into with Brown Brothers Bank to form Brown Brothers Harriman, right? Okay, so these guys are profiting huge off of the first Gulf War, right? V. Oh, yeah, I forgot to mention this, V, right? So one of the ways why this war busted OPEC is because it broke out. The old strategy of divide and conquer, right? You split out a couple, you can break up the whole damn, group, right? Right. So they split out Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Why? Well, Kuwait is obvious, right? Kuwait just got beat up bad in war. I mean, Kuwait City is like devastated, right? All the oil fields are on fire, right? And Kuwait had to rebuild. Plus, Kuwait, after it decided to build up its military, force, so it made big purchases of weapons. They had to rebuild, made big purchases of weapons. It's in debt, right? It's going to make it hard pressed for it to reduce oil production, right? In accordance with OPEC quotas, right? Another is Saudi Arabia. I'm not going to teach you all what's behind Saudi Arabia, but the key thing is, right? Saudi Arabia had massive debt also after the war, right? Not only did it have its own big bills to pay for its war efforts during the war, right? But it made big purchases of weapons, significant weapon systems, a whole bunch of U.S. F-15 fighter planes, a whole bunch of British Challenger 2 tanks, right? But it also paid 60% of the entire U.S. bill for that war. So the total bill for the U.S. was 60 billion here, right? They paid 36 of that 60. 60% of that paid out of the pockets of the Saudis. Now this threw them in big debt, right? Now debt is leverage, right? You got to pay this debt. So to pay that debt, they had to maintain oil production. So they lost control of their oil production, right? Which means they lost control of price. And then if that disrupts and fragments OPEC, which it did in the 1990s, right? They lost control of oil price. All right. So VW Halliburton, right? X Halliburton's owned by Dresser. Y, right? Owned by Brown Brothers, Harriman Bank. Z, where's Z here? What the hell's Z? Z. Where's Z? Oh, Z. Oh, yeah. I mentioned Dick Cheney. So Dick, during the first Gulf War, guess who's Secretary of Defense? Guess who's, doling out these big fat no bid contracts? Dick Cheney, right? And guess what Dick Cheney becomes after the first Gulf War? He becomes CEO of Halliburton. Oh, what a deal, right? And he's CEO of Halliburton between 1995 to 2000. During that time, he is the guy who orchestrated, negotiated, the acquisition of Halliburton by Dresser Industries. So he's setting up the Bush family to profit, they're going to profit greatly off of the second Gulf War. Now, there's really two companies, but really they're the same. Halliburton, KBR, Kellogg Brown Root. Brown Root comes from, Root Brown here, right? But Kellogg comes from Dresser Industries, acquired Kellogg, a different company, right? So they formed Kellogg Root Brown, right? Now, Halliburton and Kellogg Root Brown profited greatly off of the second Gulf War, all right? All right, so, by the way, next is, so the first Gulf War, I have an arrow showing it leading directly to 9/11 attacks, which then led to the War on Terror. The War on Terror started after we were attacked on 9/11, right? Got to go fight these guys. Well, yeah, the scumbags attack us. We got to go fight them, right? But the thing about it is, I read, I'm willing to bet that the media never mentions anything about what Bin Laden was thinking, all right? All right, never, right? And I'm willing to bet that the average American knows nothing, all right? So I'm thinking, why the hell did Bin Laden attack us? What's making this guy tick, right? I just want to know what's this guy, is he just a kook or what? So I read a book on, which is a collection of his writings and his speeches, right? Guy's name was Lawrence. I can't remember what his first name was. Anyway, so he compiled this thick book of his writings and speeches. I read every damn page, every damn speech he made, everything he wrote, right? And he's saying the same stuff over and over, about maybe like half dozen reasons, right? Key among that was, I'll tell you right now that everything, almost everything, came off of the first Gulf War, right? For example, he was pissed off and he blamed the United States for the death of 600,000 Iraqi kids dying after the first Gulf War, right? Now, he exaggerated because he based his number upon United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization estimate of 567,000 Iraqi kids having died by, between 1991 and 1995 due to the sanctions, right, applied in the country. Now, what were those sanctions? Right after the first Gulf War, we knew Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Why? Hell, right? The U.S., the Reagan administration authorized the sale of all that stuff to Iraq in the 1980s. All the material to build, chemical weapons, all the equipment, right? They authorized, you read the Rangel report, right? On, dual use, items, right? That can be used for both civilian and also military. Man, you got page after page after page of biological toxins, all sorts of crazy biological toxins we sold to Iraq, right? Right, so we knew we had them, and we seen them use them during the Iran-Iraq war against Iran, right? But the thing about it is, we ordered them to, what happened was there's a United Nations resolution which demanded you got to eliminate your WMD and you got to submit to inspections. We're not going to let you sell a drop of oil out of your country until you prove to us that you have eliminated your WMD. So that started a 7-year UN weapons inspection program where they're searching for WMD throughout the country, all right? And now during this time, they can't sell oil, all right? And oil is 60% of their economy, all right? That's huge chunk of your economy. Now, does that leave 40%? No, because you take out that 60%, right? That kills a bunch of what's remaining, right? So they're sucking wind economically, right? They're desperately poor, and a lot of these kids are just not getting enough food, right? Kids are dying, right? Malnutrition and just starvation, right? So it's a bad situation over there, and who does Bin Laden point the finger at? He points a finger at the United States, right? So that pissed him off, right? Other things, he's always pissed off saying U.S. is starting these wars over in the Middle East. U.S. Is controlling Middle Eastern oil, right? And a lot of things he said, I believe, was false, right? For example, he said, the U.S. has making deals with the Saudi royal family, keeping them in power, right? And to do this, they get deals from, the Saudi royal families artificially lowering price, right? And that's impoverishing the country, and that's causing the standard of living to go down, which it did, right? It's more than that though. And really, what it was in the first Gulf War created debt, right? Saudis had to keep pumping out oil, right, to pay their bills, right, pay their debt, right, and that led to basically a breakdown of OPEC. Right? It was a little bit more complex than he understood it, right? But anyways, a bunch of things pissed him off, and that, they stem mostly, including troops permanently stationed in Saudi Arabia. He was pissed off about that, right? Where he said he believed they're just to exploit their oil, right? And so he attacks us on 9/11. And this leads to the war on terror. So this was a direct outcome of the first Gulf War. And then, of course, Bush #2 takes the attack by Al-Qaeda and uses that to attack Iraq. All right, that's a bait and switch there. And then we get the second Gulf War. All right, now from the second Gulf War, again, KBR and Halliburton are profiting big time off of that, right? And also that gives us, remember the brief comments I gave you from Richard Clark, right? And he's quoting, defense analysis at the Army War College, right? How this was a significant strategic blunder, right? Giving all sorts of support to Al-Qaeda, building up their movement, right? And it vastly increased the terrorist threat, right? Including the formation of ISIS, right? Which didn't exist until after we invaded. And what's funny is this, right? ISIS is, formed of, I guess a coalition of ex-Iraqi military and all these radical right-wing fundamentalists, extremists, Islamic extremists, right? Right? And so prior to the war, it was the government and the military that were hunting these guys down because they're a threat to the government, right? Now you go in there and invade, these guys joined forces, right? And the extremists radicalize the military, and the military militarizes, the radicals with weapons, tactics, training, and so forth, right? They join forces, they become a bigger threat, right? A threat big enough that they can take territory. They become a state controlling resources, which is a significantly, escalation in the threat. All right, so ISIS had to be defeated, and I wrote a strategy for that. All right, EF. Now, what are the common denominators here? Well, you got Bonesman running the show here, starting these wars, right? So Bonesman, war. You got banking behind this, right? You have military industry. You have oil, right? And you had these neocons, right? They're henchmen, including Cheney is a neocon, right? All right. Now, what I want to do now is give you an expanded view to see how these guys are a tight group. They're all related to each other. They all go to school together, right? They all have the same corporate interests and banks, right? And again, this is just a glimpse into this group. But I'll start here with Prescott Bush's. Remember Prescott Bush here, one of the key bonesmen who was a partner, original partners of Brown Brothers Harriman Bank, right? So his father-in-law was George Herbert Walker, all right? And George Herbert Walker was president of W.A. Harriman Bank. So he's connected to Harriman here, right? He was also director of Union Banking Corporation. Now, both of these banks were Nazi banks, supported the Nazis in the 1930s, even up until November of 1942, right? When we're already at war with Germany, right? Um, that's patriotism for you, huh? All right. So let's talk about Averill Harriman here, right? Averill Harriman, again, a bonesman, class of 1913, owned Brown Brothers Harriman Bank, which supported the rise of Hitler and the Nazi war machine. Owned Dresser Industries, that bank, right? Which eventually came to own Halliburton and KBR. Averill Harriman offered his assistance to be Assistant Secretary of State for the Far East, and then he was made acting Secretary of State in the lead up to the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Played a key role in the start of the Vietnam War. Let me give you an example, right? Just off the head, one of the documents I remember, Averill Harriman was overseeing one of the programs called the Strategic Hamlet Program, right? And one of the unfortunate, this was kind of a ridiculous program because it took South Vietnamese peasants off their land, which were given to them by the communists during the French Indochina War. It took them off the land, right? Forced them into these hamlets, and then it dumped weapons upon them and said, hey, you defend yourself against the communists, right? Well, they're more likely to be aligned with the communists, for one thing. Or if they didn't care, the communists would just come straight in, strong-arm them, take the weapons away from them, right? But in any event, it became a conduit of U.S. weapons directly to the South, the Viet Cong, right? That was one of the sources of U.S. weapons. The vast majority of their weapons came from the United States, right? Now it's blamed that the communists. No, the United States was a key supplier of weapons up until the end of '64. All right, and probably thereafter. I know up until '64. All right, so started the Vietnam War, involved with Henry Cabot Lodge in greenlighting the Diem coup, which destabilized the situation there, which led to increased conflict in South Vietnam. Remember Colonel Carson said Harriman was running the show, operations in Vietnam without consulting LBJ or RFK. And here are some other Brown Brothers Harriman Bank partners again. All right. So now Prescott Bush, they were near classmates, I think 2 years apart or so, right? But he's son of Samuel Bush, who was the director of U.S. War Industries Board for Small Arms during World War I. He's on the board of directors of the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, right? He's vice president and partner in Brown Brothers Harriman. He's director of the Union Banking Corporation. Both of these were Nazi banks supporting the Nazis and the rise of the military Nazi war machine. Okay, and they maintained their operations in Nazi Germany until that should be November '42, when FDR shut them down. He was a director of Dresser for 20 years, which later acquired Halliburton, right? He was a senator from Connecticut, and he was actually golfing buddies with Ike. So he wormed his way in, with Ike, and he's father of George H.W. Bush, right? Now I go next to Roland Harriman because he is one of the classmates of Prescott Bush. They were in the same class at Yale and together in the Bonesman Club there. He's brothers of Averill Harriman, and they together owned Brown Brothers Harriman Bank. He ran Harriman's domestic operations. Again, classmate of Prescott Bush and Robert Lovett, right? Who served, and he served in the Army Ordnance Department during World War I, similar to these guys here. And okay, now I go to Robert Lovett. Robert Lovett had a lot of connections with the Harrimans. He's on the War Industries Board with Samuel Bush over here, right? Key position in arms production. Classmate with Roland Harriman and Prescott Bush. And he's considered the architect of the Cold War, along with Dean Acheson, another guy kind of considered the architect of the Cold War. He was Averill Harriman's childhood friend. These guys were buddies since they were young. His mentor was mentor of McGeorge Bundy, the guy who gave us the Vietnam War, who crafted the scheme to get us the Vietnam War. He's a partner in Brown Brothers Harriman Bank, And his father, Judge Lovett, ran Harriman's railroad interests, right? So these guys are connected. Anyways, Harriman, before they came into banking, his father, Averill Harriman's father, they gained their wealth through railroads, right? He was a big railroad tycoon. Remember the robber barons from your history books, right? In the 19th century, all right? Well, Harriman was a big railroad, big shot, and so he's running. Robert Lover's father is running Harriman's railroad interests. All right, EF. So now Prescott Bush has a son. His name is George Herbert Walker Bush, and you can see, just how remember like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, how they put a name in there to show their power, the power family relationships, right? Right. And in blue here, I highlight Herbert Walker, right? Who would name their kid Herbert Walker, right? As a middle name, right? Well, they're just showing off who their family ties are, right? Come from George Herbert Walker Bush. George Herbert Walker Bush from George Herbert Walker, right? Prescott comes from the Prescott family. There's another power family. So who names their kid Prescott, right? Well, it's because it's a family connection, right? Anyways, so he's a director of the CIA. He's an oil man that understands, how. Well, I'll explain it a lot better when I get to that section on oil. He worked for Dresser. His first job out of college, he worked for Dresser, which is owned by Brown Brothers Harriman Bank, right? He was a president during the first Gulf War, and the first Gulf War became the source of Bin Laden's motives for attacking us on 9/11, right? Go ahead and read, a book. One book is Lawrence, right? That's the book I read, right? Read a collection of Bin Laden's writings, right? He harps the same stuff over and over again. All right, so I said here, all right, some of the things he was pissed about were the kids that were killed in Iraq, right? Who died of starvation, right? He's pissed about Saudi oil production and how it's undermining oil price, and how that's leading to a major decline in Saudi standard of living. There was a significant decline from like 20,000 average, at the start of the Gulf War to like, by near the end of the century to like 13,000, right? In U.S. dollars, right, for the average family income, right? Something like that. And he was pissed about troops being on the ground in Saudi Arabia, permanently stationed there, right? Which he said are there just to, control their oil. That's his view, right? So he was pissed about that, right? I know that the media and politicians don't say a word about Bin Laden's motive. They just say, oh, they're radical, religious fanatics who want to, attack Christianity and install everything Islamic or whatever. Right? Well, he had just he barely when you read it, he barely mentioned Islam, right? Right? He's just carping and complaining about all this other. He's bitching about this other stuff, right? All right, so now that leads to the 9/11 attacks, right? And then the next Bush becomes president in administration later, and he takes the attacks by Al Qaeda and uses a bait and switch and pins it, basically flips it onto Iraq and uses that to manufacture a war against Iraq, get a resolution, right? So then we get the Iraq invasion war, GHI. And now this war, right, greatly increases the terrorist threat, including results in the formation of ISIS, HIJ, right? And what company profits off this? Well, W.A. Harriman, Dresser Industries, Halliburton, KBR, right? I'll come back to this. We'll talk more about this corporation in a little bit here, right? So now we'll go with K, Dick Cheney. So Dick Cheney was the Secretary of Defense during the first Gulf War, right? And he's dishing out big, fat, no-bid contracts, right, to like Halliburton, right? I'll give you an example. All right, here's one example. They're getting contracts for everything that used to be supplied by the U.S., Army Supply Corps or Corps of Engineers, building bases, right? Building the barracks, supplying food production, fuel transport, right? Transport of personnel. Here's one example. So they got a contract to transport troops to Iraq. Now, over 500,000 troops were in Iraq. That's over 500,000, roughly around 500,000, right? They got paid $10,000 per troop to fly an American troop over to Iraq. At that time, back in like 1991, right? You could buy a round trip ticket to like Israel from the United States for less than $1,000. Maybe $800 or $900, right? They're getting paid one way. Now, in this flight to Israel, you're not have full capacity, right? You got a plane that's maybe like 60, 70, 80% full. You're lucky to have 100% full, that's for sure. And these military transport planes, they're packing these guys like sardines, wall to wall. They're packed full, and you're getting 10 grand one way, not two ways, one way. So that was a big fat contract, no bid, right? And that's just, oh, my battery, what just happened? My battery, 50%? Why is my battery going dim? What? I hope you can still see this. My battery's going dim at 50%. That's, hold on here. Let me fix this. Where am I going here? I want to, power, system power. All right, recommended. What we got here? Where's power? Advanced. Oh no, wait a minute here. You know what? Hopefully you can still see this. I'm not going to worry about this. I'll fix this later. Okay, so Cheney, right? Then after he's Secretary of Defense, doling out big contracts to Halliburton. Well, guess what? He gets to be made CEO of Halliburton between 1995 and 2000, right? I bet you he got some big fat, stock options right during this time. But anyways, so in 1998, he arranges the acquisition, Dresser's acquisition of Halliburton. Right now, this lines up the Bush family with and all the bonesmen with Halliburton. Right. Then he's VP for the George W. Bush administration, and he played a big role in manipulating the American public and Congress into the Iraq invasion war. Right. He was harping on WMD. He was harping, saying that Iraq was behind 9/11. Right. Bush said, when Bush admitted that Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, he said, hey, no one in the administration said it did. No, that was not true. Cheney was blabbing on Meet the Press, whatever, right, that Iraq is behind this, right? And Americans bought it. All right, so that's K, right? He was CEO of Halliburton. So let's take a closer look at Halliburton, right? All right, it's owned by Dresser Industries. Dresser Industries owned by Brown Brothers Harriman Bank, right? Let's see a little background. So Halliburton Halliburton acquired Brown Root in 1962, right before the Vietnam War, right? And Brown Root made a killing off the Vietnam War, like Halliburton did off these other wars. Brown Root was doing that before in Vietnam. Acquired Kellogg. Dresser acquired Kellogg in 1987. Then when Dresser acquired Halliburton in 1998, you got Kellogg Brown Root, right? Cheney's the guy who oversaw that as CEO of Halliburton, right? Now this is just a look at some of Halliburton's, honest dealings in the Iraq invasion war, and this is a book written by a guy named Charles M. Smith, who between 2002 and 2004 was the chief of Army Field Support Contracting, right? The guy who is in charge from the Army standpoint, right, of supplying the troops, getting contracts to supply these guys, right, to help the troops, increase their warfighting ability, right, help keep them alive, give them support, Now, he wrote a book called War for Profit, Army Contracting versus Supporting the Troops. So he's saying these are not, together. Army contracting is not about supporting the troops, right? It's an opposition, he's saying, or there's some conflict here, right? So this is a quote from the very first page of his book. When contracts are mishandled, U.S. strategic goals and servicemen's lives are put at risk, right? While private pockets are lined and millionaires are made, right? Well, they're already millionaires. I mean, um, anyway, now here are some of Halliburton's abuses. Well, one is the contracts they're getting are no bid contracts, right? This is not American free competition. This is no competition. You get it with no bidding, right? Whatever you ask for, you get, right? And you get these cost plus contracts, which only encourage waste, fraud, and abuse. And I'll show you some examples coming up here, right? So the idea behind a cost plus is you get a percentage of the cost that you incur, right? So you're getting, you got a guaranteed profit, but you know what? The more you spend, the more you're gonna make, right? It encourages waste, fraud, and abuse. All right, so here's one of the things that Smith quoted or cited. He said, 1.8 billion in unsubsidized food charges, right? Or unsubstantiated food charges. So they're just like throwing in huge unsubstantiated extra charges. Sending truck convoys with extra empty trucks because Halliburton was paid by the truck, right? So you have a convoy sending goods to troops that need this stuff, right? Well, you send a bunch of empty trucks. Now you got these contractors. Most of these guys were American truck drivers who, were making maybe like 30 grand a year as a truck driver. Then they see that, well, you can make 100 grand, in less than a year if you agree to go to Iraq, right? So these guys go over there and they're driving trucks and making more money, right? But you know what? They're risking their lives. They're in a war zone. There's IEDs, and some of these truck drivers, got killed by IEDs, right? They're risking their lives, and you're sending empty trucks, right? Risking the lives of these guys only to make some more money for Halliburton, right? So they're sending, plus you're ripping off the taxpayer, right? So they're sending empty trucks, right? Just because they get paid by the truck, putting lives at risk, making more money. Excessive purchases of unnecessary Escalades and H2 Hummers, right? So they're buying vehicles for staff personnel, people at bases, right? People like in the green zone who may not even travel much, right? You buy them these. You don't buy them like a Bronco or Blazer or whatever. You buy them an Escalade or H2 Hummer, price, right? And then not just that, you're not buying them with cash. You're buying them. You're leasing them, right? And the lease costs, you're leasing them at $7 grand per month. Now I don't know what the market rate is. I bet I can look it up, but I'm willing to bet it's nowhere near $7 grand a month in today's money, right? I'm willing to bet it's probably just over 1,000 or around 1,000, right, per month, maybe even less, right? So $7 grand per month, and then what they did also is, because cost plus, they're charging. So someone probably connected is making huge on the leases, right? And then Halliburton's making money because they're paying this. So they get paid on top of this, a percentage on top of this. The more they pay, the more they get paid, right? So they're willing to pay more. Now, who's footing all this bill? The American taxpayer, right? And then they provide no oil changes, right? So these, if you use synthetic oil, you go 5,000 miles, you better change that oil, right? They're going without changing oil at all. And these cars, brand new, high-priced cars are the engines are breaking down after 10,000 miles, right? And what do? Right? They burn them, they get rid of them, and they buy new ones, right? So, they get the expense there, they get paid more, and then they buy new ones. All right. Okay, so where are we at here? And the same applied to other large orders, right? There's reports of uh, big equipment purchases like computers, right? And then they end up buying the wrong computers. I don't know how they're wrong, but then they say they're wrong. So what do they do with these computers, right? Do they send them? No, they burn them. They had burn pits where they're burning brand new computers. They get paid for these computers. Then they get paid for brand new computers, right? Um, they were contracted to provide clean water to troops, and out of 67 water treatment plant inspections, 63 out of 67 failed contamination tests. And he listed a plethora of pathogens. I don't know, cryptos, whatever they are, these pathogens, right? So they're loaded with pathogens, right? And that forced the troops to have to drink bottled water. Well, who supplied the bottled water? Well, Halliburton, right? And the thing about it is, these troops had to use that water. They had to take showers. They're taking showers with all these pathogens in it. Um, and I'm willing to bet they use that to cook food too. I mean, the food's going to be sterilized, right? Because it's going to kill all the bugs, right? But still, um, what I got here? Unsubstantiated dining fees without the required performance evaluations. Smith cites numerous cases of bribery, kickbacks, fraud, grossly inflated claims. All right, so they're making a killing off of this war. All right, that's patriotism, supporting the troops, huh? Okay, LM. Now let's step back and look at Root Brown's background. All right, Root Brown was a corporation that was connected to the hip with Congressman LBJ before he became president, right? Before he became vice president. And it got a huge contract with LBJ's help to build the Mansfield Dam. Root Brown was a big campaign contributor to LBJ's political war chest, right? LBJ as president helped Brown Root win contracts for huge construction projects for the federal government. Um, let's see, more questions were raised when a consortium of which Brown and Root Halliburton was a part of a $380 million contract to build airports, bases, hospitals, and other facilities for the U.S. Navy in South Vietnam, right? That was during the Vietnam War. And it's estimated that this consortium, controlled 85% of those contracts. 1967, a government accounting office report accused the quote Vietnam builders are called, right, as they were known, for massive accounting lapses and allowing thefts of material. Brown and Root built prisons for the captured Viet Cong. Kind of like Halliburton built prisons for, like at Guantanamo Bay for the whatever the Al Qaeda guys. All right, so let's take a look at LBJ. LBJ was connected, going way back. He played poker with both Truman and Harriman, and of course he had ties to Root Brown. Their main campaign contributor to his political war chest, right? And it was the LBJ National Security Council that gave us the Vietnam War. And I showed you how this was manipulated, right? A key architect of that was McGeorge Bundy, who, at the meeting said, hey, can we send the threat signals? Then 3 days later, he provides a 30-day plan, a list of threat signals, right? And they conduct the plan and do more than what's on the plan. And I say here, he's a bonesman. Yeah, he's engraved. Perhaps the key architect of the Gulf of Tonkin incident. He was a central figure there, right? Wanted provocation signals sent and wrote the 30-day plan, drafts of the Tonkin resolution, right? He was kind of controlling that, or wrote that himself, a part of it, right? All right, so his brother is PQ, William Bundy, right? Another bonesman. He's Assistant Secretary of State for Far East Affairs, right? Married to Dean Acheson's daughter, Q, right? So this is the guy. Remember, William Bundy was like pumping up the threat signals to Vietnam, saying we're going to invade it, we're going to attack countries to the north, right? Uh, QR. Dean Acheson, right? So Dean Acheson was Secretary of State under Truman, right? And like Averell Harriman, he attended Groton Academy, then Yale. Like Robert Levitt, he was one of the architects of the Cold War. Harriman and Acheson were childhood friends. They've known each other since childhood, right? So these guys are buddies, right? You see how connected they are through marriage and everything, right? He was Harriman. So this goes to Harriman now. Harriman was given special office just 2 minutes walk, while Acheson was Secretary of State. Right. Harriman was given an office 2 minutes walk from the Oval Office. Was special assistant for Truman, interface with Truman, Secretary of Defense Department, chief advisor on international affairs and the Korean War during the Korean War in 1950, 53 or so. All right, so RS, where's RS? Where's S? Oh, S. Henry Cabot Lodge, going back down here. Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., remember he was a major shareholder of United Fruit, right? United Fruit was one of the corporations built up by Dulles, Sullivan, Cromwell law firm, all right? Negotiating concession contracts with all these dictators. All right, he was ambassador to Vietnam, in close communication with Harriman, played a key role in greenlighting the Diem coup. His grandfather was Henry Cabot Lodge. Henry Cabot Lodge was a Republican senator who was instrumental in getting the U.S. into the Spanish-American War, shepherding that resolution through Congress, the war resolution, Spanish-American War resolution, and then pushing after that, after he went to war, he was pushed an imperialist agenda policies. Kind of as an interesting note about Henry Cabot Lodge, how connected they were. He was buddies with Teddy Roosevelt and Admiral Mahan, right? The guy who wrote Sea Power, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, which was basically a textbook for, colonial world domination. How to be a world empire, right? Now ST. We'll go to Dulles. Allen Dulles was a lawyer for Harriman and Prescott Bush, the Brown Brothers Harriman and Union Banking Corporation. He was he wasn't the first director. He was a director of the CIA. That's wrong. He wasn't the first director. He was director after Beadle Smith. But he was director during the Guatemala coup, director during the Bay of Pigs, during the Iran coup, overthrow of those governments. Soon after JFK came to office, JFK was overrun by the Bay of Pigs things. JFK was first in office. This program was going, and he kind of greenlighted it, right? Right. But after that, he didn't trust Dulles. Now, John Foster Dulles was the sole managing partner of Sullivan Cromwell, neo-colonial empire builder, right? Clients included Brown Brothers Harriman Bank and Union Banking Corporation, right? So these guys are all connected. And like I said, the Dulles' uncle was Robert Lansing, all right? And he played a key role in getting the U.S. into World War I. He was Secretary of State in the Wilson administration and was key in crafting U.S. policy on weapon sales to the British and French, the Allies, right? And like I said, estimated over half of all munitions fired by Britain and France during the war were produced in the United States, all right? And that, of course, became huge. Our policy was this. The U.S. policy was, hey, doesn't matter that we're selling all these weapons to Britain and France and not to Germany, right? We declare neutrality, right? We're neutral, right? You cannot touch our ships. You cannot sink our ships. They went further than that, right? Lansing went further. He said, you cannot sink a British ship carrying weapons so long as there's one American passenger aboard. We declare, freedom of navigation for all our citizens, right? So Germany, didn't sink a U.S. ship for let's see, 15, 16, 17. Well, I don't know. 2.5 years. I guess going on 3 years. 3 years of a war. U.S. industry running full steam, manufacturing weapons for the British and French, and you cannot sink our ships, right? You think they like that, right? And what happened was by 1917, Germany was in kind of a tight situation. I don't want to give a little background, right? But they felt desperate, right? The war didn't go well for them. Wait a minute. Well, I know there was a bad crop, right? Anyway, so they felt desperate, and there's a big debate within their government, right? There's people for declaring unrestricted warfare in the U.S. There's people, against it, right? And going back and forth, all these arguments. We'll talk about that in World War I. But anyways, the guys for it won, so they declared unrestricted submarine warfare upon U.S. ships in, I believe it was April of 1917. And after they sank a few ships, we declared war upon them, so that's how we got in. But another thing that Lansing did was he was instrumental in. He played a role. I don't want to say instrumental, but he played some amount of role in the sinking of the Lusitania because the practice was, when the war started, American firms who were selling weapons to the British and French, so would they be shipped to Britain, right? Well, they would ship them on these passenger ships, like the Lusitania, big passenger ship, fancy liner, right? Well, they would load them with munitions and weapons and so forth, right? And the Germans were getting fed up with this. They're saying, listen, man, no doubt they're thinking you can't use human shields, right? To protect these. You're gonna send weapons over here to fight our boys, right? In these passenger ships. Well, you're gonna get your ship sunk, right? So no doubt they were gonna make an example of the Lusitania, right? So they contacted the Wilson administration and said, hey, can you issue a warning to your citizens not to ride the Lusitania, right? The Wilson administration refused, right? And in reply, Robert Lansing wrote the reply. They refused and wrote the reply to the German, diplomats, diplomatic communication. And in his memoirs, I read Robert Lansing's memoirs, and in it he bragged about that letter. He bragged how clever it was, how he wrote it for public consumption, right? And so they rejected, issuing a warning. And of course, the Lusitania was sunk. There were 2 explosions. It was torpedoed, and then there was a big internal secondary explosion, probably the munitions, or maybe it was a boiler, one or the other. But it sank pretty quick and took a lot of lives. And that was key early on in shifting public opinion, U.S. public opinion against Germany, right? Which is strategic. All right, so Lansing played those roles, right? So if you look at it, these guys are all connected, same club, right? They know each other since childhood. They're directly related to each other. They intermarry, right? They have the same banking interests, the same corporation interests, and they profit off of war, all right? And they get us into these wars. Okay, so that's just a quick look at the power elites, right? I'm not saying that's an end-all, be-all. In fact, when I did this research here for this chart, I did most of this in one day. It's so easy to find this information, right? Now this took longer because I had to read Michael Smith's, where's his name? Charles Smith's book, all right? All right, so remember this chart I showed you on the evolution of warfare, all right? We talked about a couple here. There's some neo-colonialism stuff going on here, but also the most of it is modern industrial. Now, I'm not going to teach you all this until I get onto the lesson on oil industry. You'll understand things better. I give a better lesson on everything, currency and so forth, right? But we saw today, the effect of LOGCAP and private military security contractors. KBR was involved in, sending mercenaries over there, right? Making a killing on that. Okay, so talking about neo-colonial wars, right? This brief section of wars right here. I got. I want to add something because I thought it was kind of funny. I say funny quote here in colonial, neo-colonial wars, right? And it kind of shows the history of corporate use of U.S. military. What I say is private use, really. So the U.S. military served as a private armies for some power elite here. And this is a testimony of a Marine Corps general guy who was, a war hero back then. He was very famous back then, right? One of the things that's kind of funny is, I kind of find amusing is his name. His name is Smedley Butler. I mean, who names their kid Smedley, right? That's just setting up the kid for abuse. But anyways, his name's Smedley Butler, right? But what's key about him is he was a Medal of Honor winner, not just one, but two. I mean, how many people win one Medal of Honor? How many people win two, right? So this is a quote from him. He said, quote, "I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service, and during that period, I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico and especially Tampico safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for national Citibank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. I helped purify Nicaragua for the international banking house of Brown Brothers. Remember, Brown Brothers was a big banking house. But he says 1902, 1912. It was a big 19th century banking house. And by 1931, it rolled in. It was bought up by Harriman Banking. All right. So that's Brown. That became Brown Brothers Harriman. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for American fruit companies in 1903. In China in 1927, I helped see to it that Standard Oil went on its way unmolested. Looking back on it, I might have given Al Capone a few hints. I thought that was kind of funny. The best he could do was operate his racket in 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents, right? That's Asia. I guess you separate North America and South America, I guess. So, all right. A lot of what he's talking about here are the banana wars, right? So, now my question is, right? I just give you a glimpse into some of the, behind the scenes inner workings of these wars, right? Do most Americans see this? No, it's like no Americans see this. All right, they just think, they got, what they got in their mind? They got in their mind the simple symbols. All right, hey, we're a democracy, right? We got freedom, right? We got the American flag, we got national anthem, all right? Good American pastimes, so forth, right? Right? Is that how democracy works? You take a sociologist like C. Wright Mills, he's just going to laugh at that, right? And his work is far more extensive than mine. Mine is just I give you this in like an hour, right? All right. So now, why do American masses support these scumbags? I say, that's a good question, right? Mostly they're ignorant of it, right? Now, do the American masses share in their profits? Hell no, right? Does modern military industrialism provide a Keynesian stimulus to the economy? Well, yeah, right. But this is my belief today, right? With today's technology, right, I believe it could be a drag on the economy, right? And that, in my opinion, it's a miss out. You're spending all this money and wealth and resources on these weapons, right? It's a misallocation of resources which are better spent on useful technologies, which will yield new products, which will create new markets, which will grow the economy, right? Including, I believe, a key thing is alternative energies, right? And energy storage. Right? Not just because of the climate, but I believe that, the potential for alternative energies to be far cheaper already are far cheaper, all right, they're rock bottom cheap compared to to coal, right? Natural gas is a little bit more efficient than coal, but they're cheaper. Both wind and solar are cheaper, a lot cheaper than hydrocarbons, right? And which will give a significant drop in energy costs, right? Now, energy costs are a significant chunk of input costs for any business, for the whole economy, right? Providing a hedge against inflation and thus providing a big boost to economic growth. Including electrifying transportation. A big chunk of the transportation within our country is trucking, right? When trucking goes electrified, that's going to drastically decrease the cost of transportation, all right? All right, so my answer is, well, why? Why do they support these guys, right? Right? And my answer is ego, pride, feel good. Me, fueling the self, right? That's all they get out of this, right? That's all they get. They get to beat their chest, wave the flag, right? And shout USA, USA, right? And in the process, right, I say here, that is all they get, and they are willing to support these scum and so become complicit in their crimes. If not, in fact, accomplices, aiding and abetting their crimes, right? And also they can go around shouting USA, USA, right? And making themselves feel good about themselves, all right? All right. Now, here's a brief, I guess, critique on nationalism, patriotism. I'm, to tell you the truth, when I was a kid, there was no one more patriotic than myself, right? For whatever reason, again, it was no doubt, it was just pure ego, pride, right? My country, whatever. It was childish, it was low level, feel good stuff. And God's honest story. When I was 7 years old, right? I begged for my own record player, for a gift, I don't know, Christmas or whatever, and I got one. And my first album was an album full of patriotic songs. Everything was national anthem, God bless America, all sorts of stuff, whatever, right? The Marine Corps, hymn, and Air Force, this and that, Navy, right? And I used to sing along with it. I was a goofy kid. And, but the way I see it now is, I'm a big opponent of nationalism, patriotism, right? I believe it's a potent sentiment of egoistic pride arising from ego identification between oneself and one's nation, right? All right, let me just finish up here. So here is a chart in which I analyze some of the causes of nationalism and the effects of nationalism. I guess I'll start with the effects, right? One effect is it can be unifying. It can create cohesion within our country, within our people. That's not bad. That can be a good thing, right? One is it could give blind support for the policies and actions of our government. That is not a good thing. You can't give blind support just because you have these like generalistic, beliefs about the goodness of our country. You can't be blind and stupid about it. It can build blind fervor for war, and it has. I mean, just look at World War One. All the damn European nations, and including the United States, all beating the war drum, all being jingoistic, right? Right? Patriotic. They're all of them nationalistic, right? Running off to war. It can give blind belief in the goodness of one's country, and it does, despite of the facts. But that's okay, because people don't retain facts, right? And I say this, a lot of people remain pleasantly ignorant. The whole idea about people, believing what they want to believe, right? Well, it's easy because they don't know any facts, right? They remain pleasantly ignorant and comfortably numb, just to borrow from a Pink Floyd line there. All right. So what creates this nationalism? The key driving force behind it is human nature. The inherent human nature to be hedonistic and self-serving, right? Resulting in self-serving bias of perceptions. I put here Clean Kanansky. My students should know that. I taught that, right? But I'm not going to talk about that now. The common tendency to believe what we want to believe, right? Ego identification between oneself and one's nation and the pride generated thereby, right? You feel good, right? This is down to your core, right? To your bones, right? That's why people get so hot about nationalism, right? It's not about, an objective, dispassionate view of facts, right? It's what makes you feel good. Socialization into a common culture, language. Yeah, we're socialized, right? Norms, values, materials, beliefs, histories, myths that we're told, right? Powerful emotional attachment to national symbols. That's another thing, right? The flag, the national anthem, eagle, right? I tell you what, people would go crazy if you burn a flag, right? Right? You don't stand up for the national anthem, people go crazy. You take a knee, right? Well, what matters? Symbols? No. What matters are our values. Why don't we stick to our values? America's got good values. But no, we don't stick to these values. We stick to some symbol because that's what makes us feel good. Cherish beliefs, values, principles. No, I gotta admit, the U.S. has good values, but do we practice them, Self-interest, right? And you could say that self-interest leads to nationalism, right? Like the self-serving belief that one's personal prosperity depends upon the prosperity of the nation, right? And, I take a look at the British, right? They believe that, how well their world empire goes is how well they do as a nation, as a people, right? The whole thing with the sun never sets on the British Empire. They were all pro that British Empire stuff because that's about their own personal wealth too. All right, so now I expect, maybe I did kind of a ragged job teaching this. So I'll expect an attack here, right? Right. So how, and no doubt the liars are going to attack. They always do. So the liars are always dying to attack. They're looking to just try to find some little angle in to attack, some wormy way to shift all focus onto it, make that represent everything in the people's minds, right? And then attack. So the liars count on no one doing a fact check. The liars count on no one remembering a single thing, right? I mean, I gave you a lot of facts. It's probably all blur now. You don't retain these because you don't grow the dendrites to form neural connections from one quick pass over of this, right? Only the overall impression lasts. And that lasts only for a day, right? With the overall impression no longer rooted and anchored in facts, right? It is wide open to attack. Now, how will the liars attack? Well, usually they shift focus onto a single point attack, right? Some single vulnerable item they shift all focus to and say, see, the whole thing is bullshit. Because look at this thing, right? And they take one thing that can be totally true, but maybe hard to believe, and they'll just make an attack upon that, right? Or a lot of times they just use one word reality, right? Which is a joke. Things like, unreal, unbelievable, conspiracy theory, right? Or they do a smear campaign with some unsubstantiated general accusation. Not credible. It's full of errors, right? You can't believe it, right? Or they'll just make a mocking joke. They'll attack me, ridicule me, laugh at me, and say, see, he's a joke. Don't believe what he says, right? And it'll undermine the perceptions of credibility, right? Or they'll label it with some sort of derogatory term. Well, that's just radical, rantings or liberal hogwash or something like that. Right? Or they'll use the old lawyer trick, right? Lawyer lies. Try to plant a seed of doubt in any way possible, right? People won't retain the facts. So if you plant the seed of doubt, and this doubt gains a focus, becomes the center of focus, right? Well, that becomes to define the whole thing. So I dare you to do this. Fact check everything I said here. in these diagrams. Okay, fact check it. All right, so I hope let's go through the introduction here. So this is my fourth video, on how U.S. starts war. I'm not teaching you a war, right? I'll show you many more wars to come, but in this case, I just wanted to step back a bit and show you how this can happen in our country, which is a democracy, right? And I want to show you the people behind this and how tight of a group they are. I hope you see how they're so connected. They grew up together, right? It's networks of power families. They all have the same corporation, the same banks, whatever. Right? I want to give you an idea of how this is a historical pattern, not a one-time incident, right? And give you a glimpse into a sociologist's perspective of how power really works in our country, right? It's not about Mr. Smith goes to Washington, right? It's not about what you learned in 7th grade, government class, right? All right, that's it for this lecture.